Love your neighbor. A simple message that we've all heard before and understand intuitively. Love your neighbor. A simple message, powerful enough to be censored for 20 years, win an Academy Award, and be at the center of countless debates over propaganda, censorship, and film history. Let's talk about that. Norman McLaren was an extremely influential animator and filmmaker who made films for the National Film Board of Canada and other studios from between the mid-1930s to the late 1970s. His work is remembered for testing the limits of the cinematographic equipment of his time, including painting directly onto celluloid film in order to animate footage without the use of a camera, and animating sound and music by drawing sound waves directly onto cards, photographing each of them, and playing them through a sound projector. McLaren was a trailblazer for artistic expression through filmmaking and animation techniques that weren't readily available until the age of non-linear video editing software, and almost irreplicable in artistic character. Most of his films were directed at a wide audience, and were both experimental and intended for mass entertainment. One of his films, however, stood apart from the rest of his catalog, if only for the controversy it generated. Neighbors, McLaren's most popular and most controversial film, was released in 1952 and is ostensibly an anti-war film. This short film, however, combines many of McLaren's experimental techniques and tells a deceptively simplistic narrative that is absolutely filled with symbolism in every part of the frame. Alright, first we'll talk techniques and then we'll talk symbolism. One of McLaren's most iconic filmmaking techniques is his animation of sound. The soundtrack to Neighbors, as well as most other films by McLaren, don't actually make use of any actual instruments to play the soundtrack. In an article describing his experimental sound animation techniques, Norman McLaren writes, "A small library of several dozen cards, each containing black and white areas representing sound waves, replaced traditional musical instruments and noise-making devices in the animated sound process developed at the National Film Board in Canada. When the film is developed and printed and run on a sound projector, the photographed images of these black and white drawings is heard as either noise, sound effects, or music. It is therefore logical to call the kind of sound produced in this way animated sound, for it's made by the same method as animated pictures, and from a creative and artistic point of view, it shares many of the peculiarities and possibilities of animated visuals." This technique allowed McLaren to fully create his own soundtracks without the need of any audio recording equipment. Animating sound this way makes Neighbors feel both cartoonish and surreal, especially in combination with McLaren's next experimental technique, pixelation. For Neighbors, McLaren's animating medium wasn't a brush or pen, it was a human body. By taking individual photos for each frame of the film, McLaren creates a visual language that is both separated from the rules of reality and visually indistinguishable from it. When each neighbor smells the flower, they fly around the frame straight out of an animated cartoon. When later their jealousy comes to blows, each impact is painfully snappy. The combination between the animated and the real causes Neighbors to at times feel like entertainment and at times feel crushingly precise in its depiction of cruelty. Combined with McLaren's animated sound technique, these two experimental techniques allow Neighbors to alternate between feeling animated and real whenever it desires to, which McLaren uses to great effect. William Jordan examines McLaren's experimental filmmaking techniques and career in another article, writing that McLaren's work methods, particularly with the NFB, may be characterized four ways. 1. He attempts to keep at a minimum the technical mechanism standing between the conception and the finished film. 2. He personally executes the mechanisms that do remain. 3. He makes the very limitations of the technical mechanisms, when brought into touch with the theme, the growing point for visual ideas. 4. He takes every opportunity to improvise at the moment of shooting or drawing. Alright, now let's talk symbolism. Part 1. The Neighbors. The neighbors themselves are nearly identical in most appreciable ways. They have the same house, they have the same chair, they even have almost the exact same newspaper. In a journal article from Indiana University Press's Film History, Chris Manson writes, "A solely linear reading of Neighbors as a simplistic allegory for war yields little pleasure. Palindromic reading, on the other hand, locates the marigold as the focal point of mimetic desire between the two men and the source of escalating violence. One neighbor observes the other's deep desire for the flower, and his desire is drawn in turn. The equivalence of the neighbors in relation to that point neutralizes viewer identification with either of them as a potential model. Reading the relationship between the neighbors palindromically, their actions and desires mirror each other not because of the allegory, but because of each other. The actions of one neighbor in turn cause the actions of the other. This palindromic understanding is presented clearest in a symbol we've already talked about. Did you forget it already? If you blinked, you missed it. Part 2. The newspaper. The newspaper each neighbor holds at the beginning of the film states in bold text a palindrome that contains the same intrinsic meaning. One states, war certain if no peace, while the other states, peace certain if no war. The irony of the tautological nature of each statement is not lost on us. On a surface level read, each statement is a playful inversion of the other, with no deeper meaning. Diving deeper, however, each statement does actually convey something different. I would argue that the newspaper represents ideology. Each statement carries the same factual information behind it, but depending on your interpretation can mean entirely different things. War certain if no peace suggests a pessimistic, hawkish outlook where peace doesn't seem like a realistic option. Peace certain if no war, however, suggests an optimistic pacifist outlook with a constant tinge of anxiety behind it. Peace is a desirable outcome, but the threat of war is still present. This is despite the fact that etymologically each statement is equivalent. The newspaper represents ideology and how our beliefs and interpretations of the same situation can result in entirely separate responses. If a single true fact, the dynamic between peace and war, can be interpreted in two diametrically opposed and mutually valid ways, then how can truth surmount the influence of ideology? Part 3. The flower. The flower is the most persistent and impactful symbol throughout Neighbors, which from the outside seems strange. It's a flower. The choice of a flower is rhetorically interesting because it carries no intrinsic worth other than its allure. The neighbors aren't going to turn around and sell the flower, for instance. The conflict is driven only by what the flower represents: desire. The flower represents allure and beauty itself. The flower's living, animated body suggests that its allure and beauty is intrinsically good. It reacts to each neighbor positively and cowers in the face of violence, for example. If the flower itself is good then, how do we understand the neighbors? We don't have any indication from McLaren whether one neighbor had a more valid claim to the flower. In fact, that's the point. The destruction of the flower represents how greed and violence corrupt the intrinsically good, and how each step justifies its mean until the end is ruined. The flower itself takes no part in this dynamic other than being an object of allure. Each step the neighbors take towards hoarding the flower for themselves is a reasonable escalation of the situation that they're facing, and yet the whole situation ends up feeling out of proportion. Part 4. The fence. The fence symbolizes the role of property and ownership in the dynamic of the neighbors. Originally, the neighbors aren't concerned with ownership at all, in fact. The neighbors are shown to enjoy the flower together in peace for quite a bit of the film. The escalations start when one neighbor begins to assert a claim over the flower itself. The fence is a metaphor for this conflict. The shifting of the fence demonstrates how the flower shrinks in its role during the conflict, all the way to the point of its destruction. If the neighbors were simply able to coexist with the flower, they would have still had everything they desired. The assertion of ownership is what drives the escalation of the conflict. Part 5. The house. The house is probably not the first symbol you've thought of if you haven't watched Neighbors before. It very easily fades into the backdrop of the scene. One can well imagine it being a backdrop element. If you've watched Neighbors before, it's very likely the first symbol you've thought of. The destruction of each neighbor's home and the murder of the wife and child are a sign that the conflict has reached a point of self-indulgence. The flower has been long forgotten, as are the property rights. The point is no longer about preserving something beautiful for oneself or maintaining ownership over it. The point to each of the neighbors is to hurt the other more deeply than themselves. Conclusions. In a chapter of his book, Reader of Animation Studies, William Moritz states, "These characteristics of McLaren's work are not those of a modernist artist, but rather what we have come to think of as a postmodernist artist." someone who does not reject modernism but instead recognize it as one style among many while rejecting the ideas of progress and uniqueness of the new that informed the modernism. Someone who loves irony and double coding, rejects the privileged status of high art as opposed to popular art, and feels free to mix elements of past and present, abstract and representational, appropriated and invented, all redefined and revealed to a new audience. Understanding Norman McLaren as an early postmodern filmmaker colorizes much of how we interpret his film. Neighbors is meant to entertain, but it's also meant to question prevailing attitudes about identity, desire, and possession. McLaren's Neighbors doesn't concern itself with fitting into the bounds of high art or pushing forward the medium of film. If it does so, it pushes these forwards for its own sake and not for the sake of a grand cultural project. McLaren writes his message to all the countries of the world to do just that, to entertain, to outreach, maybe to question the unquestioned. In doing research for this video, I came across multiple accounts of backlash to Neighbors due to its stance on property rights. Some saw the fact that neither neighbor had a valid claim to the flower as a refutation of the right of ownership. Overall, McLaren's Neighbors is chiefly concerned with creating a film that plays with interesting techniques for its own sake, to tell the mix of messages that McLaren wants to tell. And I, for one, think that's a good thing. My name's Zach, and I'll see you next time.